Undercover owner flies in his own airline, stops cold when he hears Curaçao. Passengers behind him. Alexander Finch knew something was wrong the moment he stepped into John F. Kennedy International Airport that morning. Everything seemed normal at first glance. The echoing announcements over the intercom, the hurried steps of travelers rushing to catch their early flights, the perpetual glow of fluorescent lights illuminating streams of rolling luggage and bleary-eyed passengers. But as the founder and secret owner of the up-and-coming Orion Skies Airlines, Alexander prided himself on reading the smallest signs, whether in a crucial business negotiation or in the humdrum of everyday life. He had decided that day to fly incognito on one of his company's flights from New York to Los Angeles to conduct a surprise inspection of how his airline truly treated its passengers. Little did he know that this seemingly routine journey would turn his entire perspective on success, trust, and personal responsibility upside down. To maintain his cover, Alexander dressed in a simple dark grey hoodie, worn jeans, and a battered carry-on bag. He'd even scuffed his usually polished shoes. At 38, Alexander Finch looked younger than his age due to his sharp jawline and fit physique. But he had carefully cultivated the image of a modest traveller. There was no chance anyone would mistake him for the multi-millionaire CEO who had grown Orion Skies Airlines from a single small route to an ever-expanding network that serviced dozens of cities across the United States and, increasingly, abroad. Alexander had decided on Flight OS 179, a routine morning flight departing at 7 a.m. from Terminal 4. He arrived at the terminal just after 5:30 a.m. to watch how people were greeted at the check-in counters, how baggage was handled, and how quickly or politely the staff responded to issues. He hovered near a line of uncertain travelers, each clutching passports or IDs, with the occasional toddler screaming in the background. Whenever Alexander noticed an Orion Skies employee, he observed them intently without appearing too inquisitive, making mental notes on whether they greeted passengers warmly, whether they noticed the anxious face of a mother traveling alone with her kids, or whether they offered assistance to an elderly couple shuffling with heavy suitcases. Orion Skies prided itself on excellent customer service and competitive prices. It had always been a core belief of Alexander's that if he set an example of genuine kindness, respect, and an earnest drive to solve problems, his employees would do the same. Of course, once a company grew beyond a certain size, it became harder to maintain that personal touch across thousands of staff. He was aware of that challenge. Still, Alexander believed he could anchor Orion Skies to a culture of integrity and compassion. He had done so from day one, but rumor had reached him recently disgruntled feedback from loyal customers, internal hints of mismanagement, rumors of a chain of unethical decisions on flights that suggested some corners of his organization were not living up to this standard. For an entrepreneur who had poured his heart and soul into building his airline from the ground up, that was unacceptable, hence today's undercover mission. He lingered by the Orion Skies kiosk machines, watching travelers poke at the touchscreen to print their boarding passes, or occasionally approach the staff at the assistance counter. No glaring issues jumped out at him, although he did notice one employee, a short-haired woman in her early 20s, with an air of impatience. She rolled her eyes when a passenger explained they had accidentally cancelled their seat assignment. Maybe it was only a momentary lapse, but Alexander stored it away mentally for a later talk with HR. Service, he believed, was all about consistent kindness. By the time he moved through security, the clock read 6:15 a.m. The lines had grown significantly, as typical for a busy international airport at the crack of dawn. He removed his shoes, belt, laptop from the battered carry-on, and trudged through the scanners with everyone else. No special privileges today. It was the only way he could experience the everyday passenger's perspective. A year ago, if he'd tried this approach, he would have done it with his usual flamboyance, dressed in a crisp suit, with an entourage. But now he needed anonymity. After the usual shuffle, collecting his bag from the conveyor belt, sliding his belt back through the loops of his jeans, he joined a cluster of bleary-eyed travelers waiting by gate B-22, where an Orion Skies Boeing 737 MAX was parked outside on the tarmac, the bright morning sun reflecting off its silver fuselage. The distinctive logo of Orion Skies, featuring a stylized constellation design, glinted on the plane's tail fin. At 6:30 a.m., gate attendants announced boarding would begin shortly. Checking the boarding pass he'd intentionally booked in basic economy, Alexander noted seat 24B. A middle seat, definitely not the most comfortable, but perfect for his undercover role. He slipped into the boarding queue along with the rest of the basic economy travelers, determined to gauge the check-in and boarding processes at the actual lowest rung of seating. No special lounge access, no business class perks. He was just another passenger, a speck in the crowd. Alexander offered a quick smile to the gate agent scanning boarding passes. She returned a polite but largely mechanical greeting. He suspected a note of fatigue in her eyes, perhaps from an early start or not enough staff on duty. He walked down the jet bridge, ignoring the slight thrumming of his heart, some nerves about the flight, though he travelled frequently enough. But he was also excited. He had built Orion Skies to be more than just an airline. He wanted it to be a symbol of a new generation of air travel that prioritized humane experiences. Could that vision truly scale, or was it being lost in the typical corporate machinery? Inside the aircraft, the flight attendants stood by the door, welcoming passengers. A tall African-American woman in her mid-30s, name tag reading Patricia, flashed a genuine smile. "Good morning," she said warmly, taking each passenger's measure in a friendly, non-invasive way. Alexander felt a spark of pride. Such staffers were the heart of Orion Skies. Even if some corners of the operation had turned sour, he was grateful that employees like Patricia upheld the brand's spirit. He made his way through the narrow aisle, passing overhead compartments that were already filling up with rolling luggage and backpacks. Seat 24B was near the rear of the Boeing 737 MAX, smack in the middle row, with a window seat to his right occupied by a slight, anxious-looking man rummaging through a laptop bag. The aisle seat to his left was empty for the moment. Alexander carefully placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, ensuring no one else had trouble with space, and then slipped into his seat. He pulled out his phone to send a final text to his personal assistant Rosalind to keep an eye on a major supplier negotiation that morning. Then he turned on airplane mode. The cabin continued to fill. He watched for body language cues in the flight attendants. Were they hustling to help stow luggage? Did they greet each passenger with courtesy? Were they responding to special needs? So far, so good. But the real test would come when they were in the air. A moment later, the occupant of 24C, the aisle seat, arrived. She was a young woman in her mid-20s, carrying a large purse and a thick novel. She offered Alexander a polite nod, squeezed past, and settled into her seat, burying herself behind the novel's cover. Alexander leaned back, content to let the flight proceed. He had a notepad in his pocket to jot down any quick feedback or thoughts. Then, within minutes, he heard a murmur of conversation from the row behind him. He wasn't paying attention at first. People chattering about connecting flights or complaining about overhead bin space was routine on any flight, but something about the hushed, urgent tone of the voices caught his ear. At first, it was just words drifting in and out. "I told you! Risk! Those idiots!" He couldn't make out the context. Alexander shifted subtly in his seat, glancing around as passengers continued to settle. The voice sounded like a man in his 30s, accompanied by another man with a deeper baritone. They spoke in hurried whispers. Despite the hush, one or two key sentences popped out. "Did you wire the money?" asked the deeper voice. "I'm waiting. I want to see if it's even worth it," said the slightly higher-pitched voice. "They might not catch us. You said your friend at corporate could fix the logs." Alexander felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle. Fix the logs? Friend at corporate? A swirl of uneasy speculation filled his mind. Were they employees? Passengers engaged in some shady business? Possibly. The only logs that might be relevant to an airline would be flight logs, scheduling logs, or internal corporate records. Fix them? That had the ring of corruption or fraud. He froze, tilting his head just a fraction to catch more. Another snippet drifted into earshot. The invoice from that warehouse in Atlanta. We disguised it as catering supplies, but as soon as we land in LA, we'll finalize the sale. That's a cool $1 million, easily. The deeper voice gave a low chuckle. You think Finch doesn't suspect a thing? People say he's too trusting, but they also say he's got eyes everywhere. Alexander's blood ran cold. Finch, his last name. They were talking about him. He swallowed, forcing himself not to spin around. This was a potential bombshell. Someone was scamming or embezzling from his airline, disguised as catering supplies. $1 million invoice from an Atlanta warehouse. His mind raced through the possibilities. Orion Skies did source catering from multiple third parties, including a major supply chain out of Atlanta for West Coast flights. But the operation behind him, two men discussing fixing logs and faking invoices, suggested a deep infiltration that threatened the integrity of his entire enterprise. He tried to remain calm. The last thing he needed was to alert them to his presence. So he gazed out the window, feigning casual interest in the tarmac, the ground crew loading luggage below. His heart pounded. He had come on this flight to gather intelligence about routine service. Instead, he might have stumbled onto a conspiracy that could be bleeding his airline of large sums of money. He needed more details. How many were involved? Who was the friend at corporate? He listened carefully. The men behind him were speaking in half-coded references, perhaps to keep from being overheard by random seatmates. But it seemed they were so confident no one would understand that they were letting slip crucial hints. Alexander caught mention of accounts payable and Sarah's signature, though not much else. Then he heard the two men mention, take down Finch if it comes to that. At that, a cold sweat broke out on Alexander's forehead. Take down Finch if it comes to that. Did they mean literal harm to him, or a sabotage of his reputation, or something else entirely? The flight had not even taken off yet, and already everything Alexander had built might be in jeopardy. Some kind of high-stakes wrongdoing was afoot. Could it be that an insider was selling out or forging documents? His first instinct was to reach for his phone and call someone Rosalind, or the airline's head of security, or the CFO, but the aircraft doors had just closed. The flight attendants were preparing to do their safety demonstration, and soon the plane would be taxiing to the runway. He risked glancing at his watch. 6:55 a.m. They'd be taking off soon. No chance to safely place a call now. He cursed the timing. He'd have to wait until they were airborne and the seatbelt sign went off. Maybe slip to the lavatory and send a quick text or email. But he also didn't want to tip off the men that someone behind them was onto their scheme. Hoping for more details, Alexander angled his head slightly, as if trying to get comfortable. The men's voices had dropped even lower as flight attendants moved down the aisle, reminding people to power off phones or switch them to airplane mode. One flight attendant paused to remind the pair behind him to stow their electronics for takeoff, so they hushed for a moment. Over the next few minutes, the cabin dimmed slightly as the overhead lights were turned off for takeoff and the engines roared to life. Alexander forced himself to remain outwardly calm. Yet inside he was seething. He'd worked too hard to build Orion Skies to let a pair of conspirators sabotage it. He tried to puzzle together the details. An invoice disguised as catering supplies, $1 million sale, a friend at corporate adjusting logs, the mention of Sarah's signature, and the ominous mention of take down Finch. That could mean blackmail, or exposure of certain finances, or sabotage. The possibilities turned his stomach. The plane taxied onto the runway. The thrust of the engines pressed Alexander into the back of his seat as the Boeing 737 MAX soared into the sky. Cloud banks slid past the windows, and soon they were at cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and flight attendants began the standard announcements about in-flight service. Alexander carefully unbuckled. He considered heading to the lavatory to make a quick call, but at that precise moment the men behind him resumed talking in hushed but intense tones. "I'll get a text from Delgado once we land," said the deeper voice. "He's got the final contract set. We transfer the funds, we get a cut, and Finch's Golden Boy brand is tarnished. The media picks up the scandal finances, safety corners cut, whatever Delgado can muster. If Finch tries to fight it, we'll release the logs showing overcharging of passengers. The public uproar alone would force a sale. Then we walk away with our share from the new owners." Alexander's jaw clenched so tight he thought he might crack a tooth. They want to force a sale of Orion Skies. This was bigger than a petty embezzlement scheme. They planned to ruin his reputation, possibly under the false pretense that the airline was scamming passengers or had compromised safety. If they manipulated the logs to show systematic wrongdoing, the media would turn on the airline. He pictured the headlines: "Orion Skies embroiled in scandal, CEO Finch denies wrongdoing." The airline's stock price, though privately held, it had certain public financial instruments, would crash. Morale would collapse, and any expansion or brand-building efforts would be instantly crippled. The conspirators behind him were orchestrating a perfect storm of blackmail and sabotage to sell the airline at a bargain price, pocketing millions. They might have partners all the way up the corporate chain. Heat surged in his chest. He had to stop them. But how? He couldn't exactly turn around and confront them at 35,000 feet. Also, they were not alone in this scheme, from the sound of it. They had contacts at corporate, a man named Delgado, and possibly others, and the mention of Sarah's signature. Sarah O'Neill was the CFO of Orion Skies, a no-nonsense professional who'd worked with Alexander for years. She was loyal, he was certain, and extremely meticulous with finances. Could she have been unwittingly signing off on suspicious vendor invoices, or was her signature being forged? So many questions. While the flight attendants began the beverage service, Alexander used the momentary bustle to stand. "Excuse me," he murmured to the aisle seat occupant. She looked up from her novel, nodded, and let him pass. He pretended to stretch, then headed to the rear lavatory. Before stepping inside, he noticed the row behind him. Two men indeed were engaged in conversation, heads bent close. One was short and stocky with close-cropped hair, the other tall and slender, wearing a black beanie. Neither gave him a second glance. Good. They didn't suspect him. Locking himself in the cramped lavatory, Alexander took out his phone. No service, of course, but there's Wi-Fi. Orion Skies offered in-flight Wi-Fi. He turned on the phone's Wi-Fi, purchased the flight pass under a random email address. He typed a hasty message to Rosalind. "Emergency. Suspicion of fraud in Atlanta catering supply chain, possibly forging CFO signature. Name Delgado. In flight OS 179. Keep quiet, gather data. Our CFO might be a target. More soon." He sent it. A swirl of anxiety seized him. There was no guarantee Rosalind was awake or checking messages at this hour, but he knew she was an early riser. She'd probably see it. Next, he considered messaging security, but that might risk digital trails that these conspirators might have ways to monitor. He decided to rely on Rosalind's discretion. She was unflappable under pressure and fiercely loyal. Once done, he tried to calm himself. He splashed water on his face, looked in the mirror at his reflection, messy hair from the hoodie, eyes that flickered with determination. "You can handle this, Finch," he told himself. With or without an entire corporate apparatus, he would not let Orion Skies crash under a conspiracy. He had always believed in decisive action. He returned to his seat. The flight attendants were rolling carts down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. Alexander nodded politely to the young woman in 24C, who stepped into the aisle so he could slide back to his seat. He ordered a coffee when the cart arrived, quietly sipping, mind racing. Behind him, the men had paused their conversation during the beverage service. The cabin was now filled with the low hum of passengers chatting, rummaging through overhead bins, or flipping through the in-flight magazine. Alexander put in some earbuds, not connected to anything, just to further cloak his eavesdropping. He leaned back, eyes closed, focusing on their conversation. He waited, listening. Like we said, Delgado's going to feed the press that data in about 2 weeks, said the higher-pitched voice. It'll be perfect timing right before the airline's big announcement about the new European routes. Finch will be forced to address the scandal in the middle of that public meltdown. The board might force him to step aside. The deeper-voiced man responded, He'll have to sell. Another major airline will swoop in. We'll get a finder's fee. Delgado gets his cut, and we all walk away wealthy. Then maybe we can do the same at another small airline. Got to dream big, man. Alexander nearly shook with anger. He forced himself to keep breathing slowly. They were predators looking to systematically tear down smaller or mid-size airlines. Possibly they had done it before. If they pulled it off with Orion Skies, many of Alexander's employees would lose their jobs, and customers would be left uncertain about tickets, points, everything, not to mention his personal wealth and legacy. He had to think quickly. How could he ensure these men didn't vanish upon landing? As if on cue, a tremor of turbulence rattled the plane. The seatbelt sign dinged on. A few passengers stirred, glancing around. Alexander heard the pilot come on the intercom, speaking calmly. Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering a patch of rough air. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The turbulence intensified, jostling the aircraft. Alexander gripped the armrests. Though he'd flown countless times, severe turbulence always put a knot in his stomach. It reminded him of how vulnerable even advanced planes like the Boeing 737 MAX could be against nature's whims. "Whoa," muttered the anxious man at the window seat. The woman in 24C snapped her novel shut, knuckles whitening as she held on to the seat in front of her. Alexander quietly reassured her it would pass soon, though he didn't want to speak too much. The overhead compartments shuddered. The cabin lights flickered momentarily. Behind him, the conversation he was straining to hear had ceased. Instead, he picked up on the men's low curses. The turbulence lasted a solid 3 minutes before tapering off. At last, the pilot's calm voice returned. "We should be out of that rough patch now. Thank you for your cooperation." When the seatbelt sign turned off again, the flight attendants resumed their tasks. A hush of relief spread through the cabin. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, reflecting on the unexpected reminder of risk and unpredictability. Running an airline is more than finances, it's about ensuring safety. That was the fundamental principle, and here these men behind him would manipulate that principle using fake data about Safety Corner's cut. He felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had built Orion Skies to do good. There was no way he would let it fall to conspirators. About 2 hours into the flight, with the seatbelt sign off and most passengers either dozing or watching entertainment on their devices, Alexander caught the approach of a familiar figure up the aisle, Amelia Hernandez, the airline's head of cabin services. She wasn't dressed in flight attendant uniform, but in business casual attire. She often flew from one airport hub to another to supervise cabin crew training and ensure consistent service standards. Her presence on flight OS 179 was unexpected. She must be traveling incognito as well, or at least on some form of observational check. The hush-hush nature of the job meant she wouldn't be broadcasting her identity. She paused near Alexander's row, scanning for an empty seat or perhaps checking service details. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. Alexander gave her a barely perceptible nod. Amelia blinked in surprise, recognizing her boss, though only a handful of top-level staff knew that Alexander Finch, in incognito attire, might randomly appear on flights. She didn't openly acknowledge him, but the subtle flicker in her expression confirmed she saw him. Then she moved on. Alexander hoped she hadn't inadvertently blown his cover in front of the conspirators. Moments later, Amelia quietly took a jump seat near the galley, presumably observing how the flight attendants interacted with passengers. She typically compiled notes on everything from how promptly beverages were served to how politely the seatbelt instructions were conveyed. Alexander wondered if there was a way to discreetly communicate with her about the men behind him. Possibly not now, though. Any conversation might raise suspicion. At around the halfway mark of the journey, some passengers rose to use the lavatories, stretch or rummage in overhead bins. The men behind Alexander seemed to be waiting for a calm moment. From the corner of his ear, he heard them mention they might want to speak with a flight attendant about something. He quickly realized they might request additional drinks, or perhaps they were stepping away to whisper in private. Sure enough, one of the men Alexander recognized the deeper voice stood and moved up the aisle toward the forward lavatory. Alexander decided to seize the opportunity, if only he could see who he was, or perhaps follow him discreetly. Alexander waited 20 seconds, then unbuckled and stepped into the aisle, heading forward as well. The conspirator was about 8 rows ahead, waiting in line for the lavatory. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", wearing that black beanie, a slight stubble on his jaw. He scrolled on his phone, though presumably it was in airplane mode or connected to Wi-Fi. His carry-on was nowhere in sight. It must be stowed above row 25 or 26. Alexander didn't want to get too close. He hovered by the row 18 overhead bin, pretending to check if there was space while glancing occasionally. The man stepped into the lavatory. Another passenger lined up behind him. Alexander realized this was a slender chance to identify them, or even photograph them, but that would be too obvious. Instead, he strolled forward further, as if heading to chat with a flight attendant near the cockpit area. There, by the forward galley, he almost bumped into Patricia, the same friendly flight attendant who had welcomed him on board. She remembered him, apparently. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked kindly. Alexander shook his head. "I'm good, thanks. Just stretching my legs." Patricia nodded. "We should be arriving in LA, about half an hour ahead of schedule if this tailwind keeps up." "That's good news," Alexander said, forcing a polite smile. Meanwhile, the tall conspirator stepped out of the lavatory. In a lightning flash moment, the man's gaze swept across Alexander. Their eyes met for a split second. Alexander kept his face neutral, as though he was just another passenger with no particular interest. The man nodded once, casual, then headed back down the aisle. Alexander exhaled. Did he suspect anything? Alexander returned to his seat after a short delay to avoid raising suspicion. When he sat, he noticed that only one man was behind him now, the shorter, higher-pitched conspirator. The seat next to him was empty. Possibly the tall man had gone to stand somewhere else or chat with another collaborator. Alexander took the chance to pick up more clues from the short man's muffled phone conversation. He must be using the in-flight Wi-Fi to make a voice call, maybe through an app. However, the man was whispering, practically inaudible. Alexander caught just a phrase or two. "Yes, Delgado, might close early. Watch Finch's CFO movements." That was all. Then the man must have noticed someone passing by, because he clammed up. Alexander felt the seat behind him shift as the man leaned back, presumably pocketing his phone. Time inched forward. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as some passengers slept or watched the seat-back entertainment screens. Alexander was on high alert, desperate to find a way to secure enough evidence to confront these men or to prevent them from leaving undetected upon landing. If they realized their plan was exposed, they would likely vanish at LAX, stepping into the throng of travelers, possibly with fake IDs. Once gone, they could proceed with their sabotage from the shadows. As the flight neared its last hour, the tension in Alexander's chest grew. He decided on a plan. He would quietly approach Amelia Hernandez, the head of cabin services, who knew who he was. Together they could discreetly alert the captain or an air marshal if one was on board. Orion Sky's flights occasionally had discreet security personnel on certain routes, especially cross-country. If they had an air marshal here, that would be a stroke of luck. If not, maybe the captain could radio ahead to LAX for authorities to detain the suspects upon landing, but he had to do it without tipping them off. Fate intervened in a bizarre way. With about 45 minutes left in the flight, moderate turbulence returned. Flight attendants had just cleared trash when an especially sharp jolt rattled the plane. A ripple of gasps sounded through the cabin as overhead bins threatened to pop open. The seatbelt sign dinged on once again. Alexander felt his coffee cup slip off the tray table. Thankfully, it was almost empty. He quickly clipped his seatbelt. The Boeing 737 MAX bounced for a few seconds, enough to cause some passengers to cry out. In that sudden lurch, the short conspirator behind Alexander must have lost his grip on something. There was a thud, followed by a frantic shuffle. A moment later, an object clattered down the aisle. The flight attendant scurried to pick it up, but it slid to Alexander's row and bumped against his foot. Instinctively, Alexander reached down and grabbed it. It was a small black flash drive, the kind that might hold gigabytes of data, especially logs or documents. He glanced at it, heart racing. Then he realized the conspirator behind him would certainly want that back. Sure enough, he heard a hissed expletive from behind. "Where'd it go?" the conspirator demanded. Alexander had only seconds to decide. If he acted like he'd found it, the man might become suspicious. If he pocketed it, the conspirator would know it was missing. In a split-second judgment, Alexander pretended he hadn't noticed it. He carefully flicked it with the side of his shoe, letting it slide under his own seat. Then he bent down as though retrieving something else, a pen from the floor, and instead slipped the flash drive into the side pocket of his hoodie. He sat back, face blank, heart hammering 1,000,000 beats a minute. Seconds later, the short conspirator lurched forward in his seat, scanning the floor. "Do you see a black USB anywhere?" he muttered to the occupant in seat 24D across the aisle. That passenger shrugged, confusion etched on their face. The conspirator half stood, scanning the aisle, but the flight attendants were instructing everyone to remain seated due to turbulence. Alexander stayed absolutely still. Had he just secured a critical piece of evidence? Could that flash drive contain the forged logs, the fake invoices, or the data they intended to leak to the press? If so, it might be the key to saving Orion Skies. But it was also the key to these men's entire blackmail scheme, meaning they would be desperate to retrieve it. The plane continued to bump along for another tense minute. Then the turbulence eased off. The seatbelt sign stayed on, but flight attendants resumed cautious movement about the cabin. Alexander heard the short conspirator rummaging, cursing under his breath. The tall conspirator must have returned, because soon there were frantic whispers behind him. "It must have fallen somewhere. Check your pockets." "It's not on me. That's got everything, you idiot." "If we lose that, Delgado will kill us." Alexander's pulse raced. This was huge. They'd never suspect the quiet man in seat 24B, not unless he gave himself away. As soon as the plane landed, they'd likely tear up the row behind him searching for it. The big question: how do I get off the plane and into the authorities' protection with this drive before they realize I have it? He had to warn Amelia or someone with official capacity. The seatbelt sign was still on, but the turbulence had eased. He decided to slip to the back galley again and see if Amelia was around. He rose slowly, ignoring the conspirators' frantic rummaging behind him. A flight attendant passing by gently reminded him, "Sir, please stay seated until the captain turns off the sign. We might have more bumps." Alexander nodded. "I understand. I feel a bit nauseous. I need to use the restroom." He forced a pained expression. The flight attendant gave him a sympathetic look and relented, pointing him to the back galley's restroom. The short conspirator watched him from behind, but Alexander kept his face neutral, one hand pressed to his stomach as though fighting air sickness. He stepped down the aisle. The conspirators didn't stop him, presumably too concerned about the missing flash drive. In the back galley, Amelia stood, comparing notes on a clipboard with a flight attendant. She looked up, recognized Alexander, and gave a slight frown of confusion. He nodded, motioning for a moment in private. The flight attendant, who was talking with Amelia, excused herself to check on something. Quickly, Alexander leaned in, voice low. "Amelia, I'm sorry to surprise you like this, but there's a serious situation. 2 men in row 25 are engaged in a criminal conspiracy involving Orion Skies. I overheard them discussing forging corporate logs, taking bribes, and setting up a scandal to force a sale." He paused, scanning the area to ensure no one else listened. I'm Alexander Finch. I own Orion Skies." He had always insisted on a measure of anonymity outside official events, and Amelia was one of the few high-level cabin service managers who knew his identity. She nodded, wide-eyed but composed. "Sir Alexander, what do we do?" she whispered, flipping her note shut. He pulled the flash drive from his hoodie pocket and held it so only she could see. "They dropped this. It has data, possibly their entire blackmail scheme. I need to get this into safe hands and have them detained upon landing. Is there an air marshal aboard?" Amelia's eyes darted left and right. "Not on this route. The pilot didn't mention one to me, but we can radio LAX for law enforcement to meet the plane. The captain can arrange that. Let me speak to him discreetly." Alexander nodded, pushing the drive back into his pocket. "Thank you. Do it. We need them in custody before they slip away. I don't want to cause a panic among the passengers, so keep it low-key." She nodded again. "Yes, sir." Then she paused, glancing at his casual attire, the fear in his eyes. "Are you safe?" He exhaled. "As safe as I can be for now. They don't suspect me yet. But if they figure out I took this, it could be dangerous." He lowered his voice further. "Just let's get to LAX and have law enforcement ready at the gate." Amelia squeezed his shoulder in a reassuring gesture, then turned and moved toward the flight deck. Alexander lingered in the galley, picking up a plastic cup of water to maintain his airsick guise. He wiped sweat from his brow. The hum of the aircraft engines seemed suddenly ominous, like a soundtrack to a high-stakes thriller he never wanted to star in. Returning to his seat was nerve-wracking. He half expected the conspirators to leap up and accuse him of stealing their flash drive. But as he approached row 24, he saw both men hunched over, rummaging frantically under their seats, along the aisle, and even by the window seat occupant's feet. The occupant looked thoroughly annoyed, clearly clueless as to what they were searching for. Alexander slipped into 24B quietly. The men barely noticed him, too consumed by their hunt. The tall conspirator was whispering curses, gesticulating in frustration. Eventually, the flight attendants announced their final pass through the cabin, advising passengers to store their tray tables, return seatbacks to the upright position, and prepare for landing. The conspirators behind him abruptly ceased their frantic search. The tall one, in a forced calm tone, said to his partner, "Look, it's probably in your bag. We'll find it after landing. Chill." But Alexander sensed the tension in his voice. Meanwhile, Alexander felt the plane begin its descent, that familiar drop in altitude making his ears pop. Outside, the morning sun was now high in the sky, and they neared the sprawling city of Los Angeles, with its ocean glinting in the distance. Part of him wanted to relish the approach. He loved seeing new destinations, glimpsing scenic cityscapes from the air, but he was too on edge. He discreetly checked his phone. A message from Rosalind had come through via in-flight Wi-Fi. "Got your note? CFO Sarah is with me. She's checking our Atlanta accounts now. We'll handle it. Stay safe." Encouraging. At least they were on the case. As the Boeing 737 MAX dropped below the clouds, Alexander felt the tension rise. Would local law enforcement be waiting? Would Amelia have been able to speak to the captain without these men noticing? Surely, yes, he trusted Amelia's resourcefulness. But if anything went wrong, the conspirators might slip away in the chaos of deplaning. Landing gear engaged, the engines powered down for final approach. The plane leveled over the runway, tires screeching upon contact with the asphalt. Passengers who were asleep jerked awake. The entire cabin jolted as the plane decelerated, reversing thrust. Soon, the pilot guided them off the runway onto the taxiway. A few passengers clapped, a small celebratory gesture that sometimes happened on rough flights. Alexander's heart hammered. The seatbelt sign stayed on as the plane taxied. He heard the conspirators muttering behind him. "As soon as the doors open, we check overhead bins thoroughly. Then we keep going." Delgado said he'd be outside baggage claim in a black SUV. Alexander made a mental note. Baggage claim, black SUV. If local law enforcement missed them at the gate, they might still intercept them at baggage claim. Or if not, Alexander would personally chase them if he had to. but hopefully it wouldn't come to that. At last, the plane stopped at the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and people stood, eager to grab their luggage. The conspirators jumped to their feet. Alexander moved more slowly, wanting to see how this played out. The men yanked their carry-ons from the overhead bin, rummaging in them, presumably checking if the flash drive had slipped in. Their frustration was clear. The tall one hissed, "It's not here!" That was his cue. Alexander stepped into the aisle behind them, an unassuming expression on his face. The short conspirator looked back at him fleetingly, as if to see if he was part of their problem, but apparently didn't recognize him as a threat. Everyone began shuffling forward to the exit. Alexander glimpsed Amelia near the front, her posture stiff, as though she was waiting for a signal. When the conspirators reached the doorway, 2 uniformed LAPD officers and a pair of TSA officials stepped into the aircraft from the jet bridge. Immediately the conspirators froze. The tall one tried to pivot, but another officer behind them blocked the exit. A hush fell over the disembarking passengers, confusion swirling. The short conspirator stammered, "What's this about?" The lead officer, a stocky man with a calm yet authoritative voice, said, "Los Angeles Police, we have reason to believe you're carrying contraband or involved in fraudulent activity. We need to speak with you." He gestured for the men to step aside. They hesitated, but the presence of armed officers left them no choice. Passengers behind Alexander began murmuring, craning their necks to see the commotion. A flight attendant politely guided them to proceed, stepping around the confrontation. The conspirators tried to protest, but the officers guided them firmly into the jet bridge, out of direct passenger view. Amelia discreetly motioned for Alexander to follow. He took a deep breath and did so. The rest of the passengers streamed into the terminal, some glancing curiously, but the flight attendants attempted to keep everything calm. In the jet bridge, one officer recited the men's rights, stating they were being temporarily detained under suspicion of conspiracy to commit fraud. The tall conspirator spat, "Who told you that? You have no evidence." Alexander, stepping forward, cleared his throat. "Actually, I do." He pulled the black flash drive from his pocket. Their eyes went wide, shock turning to fury. The short conspirator started, "Who are you?" Amelia looked at Alexander with a nod, giving him the floor. Alexander studied the men coldly. "My name is Alexander Finch. I own Orion Skies Airlines, the company you're trying to sabotage." The conspirator's eyes flared with disbelief, then horror. The short one let out a choked, "That's impossible." "You're just a passenger?" Alexander said. "So you thought." He handed the flash drive to the officer. "I found this rolling down the aisle during turbulence. I believe you'll find incriminating data on it, files they plan to use for blackmail. Also, I overheard them discussing forging corporate logs and setting up $1 million payoff with someone named Delgado." The conspirators unleashed a string of denials, claiming Alexander was framing them, or that the drive wasn't theirs. But their panic was obvious. One tried to lunge forward, but the officer stepped in, forcibly guiding him back. Another officer retrieved handcuffs. "We'll be escorting you to a holding room in the terminal for further questioning," the officer said. Alexander stepped aside. He felt a swirl of triumph, relief, and anger. He'd never expected such a confrontation. The conspirators glared at him, but the presence of multiple officers kept them subdued. Amelia watched the scene with stoic composure, but Alexander saw the flicker of relief in her eyes. As the men were led away, the short one spat, "You might have us for now, Finch, but Delgado's still out there. This isn't over." His voice echoed through the jet bridge. The tall one wrestled with the officer's grip, letting out curses under his breath. Then they disappeared around the corner. Amelia exhaled. "That was intense. Are you all right, sir?" Alexander nodded. "I'm fine, rattled, but fine." He glanced behind him, noticing flight attendants ushering the last of the passengers off the plane. "Thank you for your help. And thank the captain for me too. We had to do this quietly." Amelia gave a half smile. "You did the right thing. I'll make sure the crew is debriefed discreetly. Passenger comfort and safety is our priority, so we don't want them feeling alarmed." Alexander agreed, stepping into the terminal. A wave of relief mingled with a strange sense of heartbreak. My own airline had become a target for a conspiracy that threatened everything. The fact that it had been orchestrated from within, or at least with inside help, cut him deeply. He'd have to root out every last collaborator, beginning with Delgado and any others who might be complicit. He pulled out his phone, and now that they were on the ground with full signal, dialed Rosalind. She picked up on the first ring. Alexander, I just heard from Sarah. There's a suspicious chain of invoices from an Atlanta catering supplier. She's uncovered multiple anomalies. We're freezing several accounts. Are you all right? He took a breath. I'm fine. 2 conspirators are in custody here at LAX. They mentioned Delgado as part of the scheme, so get legal on that. Coordinate with security. We're taking these guys down. Also, have the PR team on standby. There might be an attempt at a media scandal. We need to get ahead of it. Rosalind's voice was resolute. Understood. I'll call an emergency meeting. Where will you be? I need to debrief the LAPD and see what else they uncover. Then I'll head to our LA offices. Got it. Hang in there, boss. Rosalind's unwavering loyalty soothed him. He ended the call, a swirl of relief mixing with the adrenaline that still coursed through him. Over the next few days, events unfurled with dizzying speed. The conspirators from the flight were charged with attempted fraud, conspiracy, and various financial crimes. Delgado, real name Carlos Delgado, was found holed up in a Los Angeles suburb and was soon placed under arrest as well. Early police investigations indicated Delgado had once been a consultant for Orion Skies, fired for misconduct. He apparently harbored a grudge and had teamed up with corrupt insiders to orchestrate an elaborate sabotage. They'd planned to leak falsified logs to tarnish Orion Skies' safety record and concurrently blackmail the airline for a payout. Their end goal: cripple the airline's reputation, force a sale, and profit handsomely. The black flash drive indeed contained troves of forged documents, incriminating communications with friends inside corporate and instructions on how to manipulate certain financial transactions. The same evidence that was meant to take down Finch was used by law enforcement to build a solid case against Delgado and his associates. As for the friends at corporate, Sarah O'Neill, CFO, quickly discovered suspicious correspondences between Delgado and a low-level accountant in the accounts payable department, someone who had begun forging Sarah's digital signature on invoices that disguised funds as catering costs. HR and the compliance department took immediate action, placing that accountant and a few complicit co-workers under investigation. More arrests followed. The scheme was bigger than Alexander initially realized, but ironically, that meant authorities could dismantle the entire ring in one fell swoop. Meanwhile, Orion Skies soared in the court of public opinion. Once the real story was revealed, a group of criminals tried to sabotage the airline, but the leadership uncovered it. Many customers appreciated how transparent Alexander was once the initial shock wore off. He and the PR team put out a statement, clarifying the situation without disclosing classified details about the investigation. The newscasts and social media lit up with discussions about corporate espionage and sabotage, but the angle soon turned positive for Orion Skies. The airline's swift, decisive response, combined with the story of an incognito owner who uncovered a plot mid-flight, intrigued the public. While some questioned why an owner was flying undercover, many lauded him for personally ensuring the airline's standards and security. A week after the incident, Alexander found himself back in New York, in the boardroom at Orion Skies headquarters, addressing key executives, including CFO Sarah O'Neill, who had hammered out the final details of their internal investigation. The board gave Alexander a standing ovation for his quick thinking, though he waved it off with humility. "Don't applaud me. Applaud the flight crew, who discreetly helped contact law enforcement. Applaud Sarah and her team, who dug into the finances. Applaud Amelia, who took the message to the captain and made sure we had officers waiting at LAX," Alexander said, glancing around the table. This was a team effort. Sarah, a slight figure with steel-grey hair and a fierce intellect, allowed herself a small smile. "And it all started because you decided to experience our airline from a customer's perspective," she said quietly. "Imagine what would have happened if you hadn't boarded that flight, or if you'd booked a business seat instead of basic economy away from those men." A chill coursed through the boardroom as they imagined an alternate reality where Delgado and his cohorts succeeded. Then the General Counsel spoke up about legal ramifications, steps to tighten security, and protocols to prevent another infiltration. The airline was changing for the better, becoming more robust. As for the two conspirators, they were arraigned in Los Angeles. Their bail was set high, and they struggled to pay it. Delgado, facing multiple counts of fraud, found his associates had either deserted him or turned state's witness. The short conspirator wrote a letter to the judge claiming to be a victim of Delgado's manipulation, but the evidence on the flash drive told a different story. Ultimately, the entire ring faced trial, expected to result in lengthy prison sentences and heavy financial penalties. Alexander, once the threat was contained, felt a pang of pity for them, wondering what series of life choices had led them to orchestrate such a destructive plan. But that pity was overshadowed by relief. They had tried to sabotage not just a business, but the livelihoods of thousands of Orion Sky's employees and the trust of millions of passengers who depended on safe, honest travel. If that was the path they chose, then the harsh consequences they faced could only be called karma. In the weeks that followed, Alexander quietly resumed his normal life, although normal for him meant managing a growing airline, forging new partnerships, and grappling with the daily challenges of the aviation industry. Yet something had changed within him. The experience had reignited the same passion he'd felt when founding Orion Skies, a hunger to personally ensure everything was done with integrity and care. He realized a part of him had become complacent in the plush offices, allowing others to shape daily operations. While delegating was necessary in a large corporation, letting an unscrupulous faction burrow in was unacceptable. The entire fiasco underscored the value of truly understanding your own business at every level. Once the dust settled, Alexander launched a new internal program called Operation Aurora, aimed at surprising different branches of the airline with spot checks and incognito visits conducted by rotating teams of management. Not just Alexander. The goal was twofold: ensure consistent quality and root out any sign of corruption. Staff who were honest and hard-working would find these visits rewarding, an opportunity to showcase their dedication. Those who cut corners or exploited the system would have nowhere to hide. At a press conference announcing Operation Aurora, journalists asked Alexander about his undercover flight. He gave a modest shrug, responding, "I believe in seeing the passenger experience firsthand. I'm not just a CEO hidden in a tower. I think it's important for leaders to stay connected to the people who trust us with their lives and comfort when they fly. What I discovered that day was shocking, but it reminded me exactly why I created Orion Skies, to provide an honest, reliable and caring service. And we'll keep striving for that, no matter what obstacles arise." A month after the conspiracy bust, Alexander decided to take another unannounced flight, this time a short hop from Boston to Washington, D.C. He wore similarly low-profile clothes, jeans, a casual jacket, no tie. As he boarded, he nodded warmly to the gate attendant, who scanned his pass with a bright smile. The flight was half full, the mood relaxed. Alexander took a window seat this time, wanting to observe how the crew handled a shorter route. Shortly after takeoff, the flight attendant recognized him. She was a new hire, Ebony, who'd joined Orion Skies just 2 months prior. Her eyes lit up in quiet recognition, but she kept her composure. Approaching with a service cart, she leaned in and whispered, "Mr. Finch, it's an honor to have you aboard. Thank you for giving me a chance at Orion Skies. This is my dream job." Alexander felt warmth flood his chest. He remembered Ebony's interview. She'd been a hospitality major who overcame personal hardships to land here. He offered her a friendly smile. "Thank you, Ebony. Keep doing great work. We need more people like you." She beamed, then offered him a cup of coffee. No charge. Alexander sipped it as he gazed out the window. The crisp morning sky stretched on, clouds drifting below. Everything felt serene, a reminder that for all the turbulence in business and in life, there were always moments of calm and clarity. He replayed in his mind that day on flight OS 179, how in the blink of an eye he had learned of a plot to sabotage the airline he'd built from nothing. He remembered the panic, the adrenaline, the final confrontation in the jet bridge. And he felt gratitude for Amelia's quick actions, for law enforcement's swift response, for the honest employees who believed in Orion Sky's mission, and for the random, fateful roll of a flash drive down the airplane aisle during turbulence. Karma had come for those men, hard and swift. He'd watched it play out in real time. In the end, he realized the fundamental truth of the matter was this: if you dedicate yourself to honest work, genuinely care about the people you serve, and never stray from your core values, you can withstand even the worst storms. And those who tried to subvert integrity for greed would eventually face the storms of their own making. Now, as Alexander Finch watched the landscape passing below, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Orion Skies would continue to grow and improve. He had personally ensured that the airline's guiding principles, safety, integrity, compassion, remained unwavering. Yes, storms might come again, whether in the form of turbulence in the skies or corporate betrayals on the ground, but he knew he had the strength, the team, and the will to face them. And if any future conspirators thought they could undermine Orion Skies, they had better be prepared to face the same unyielding justice that found the men on flight OS 179. With that comforting thought, Alexander reclined his seat slightly, only as much as was polite, took another sip of coffee, and let himself exhale. This was, after all, just another day in the life of an undercover owner, watchful, determined, and ready to protect the airline that bore the emblem of a constellation soaring among the stars.